Alright guys, this is the final section of our Gameolgy series on the survival horror genre. If you haven't watched any of this series yet, be sure to check that out before watching this video. And now that I've said everything I wanted to on the topic of the genre, I'd say it's high time for me to list off my favorite games in the genre. Just like with any other list like this I've done, nothing here I'm saying is fact. This is strictly my own opinion of what I think represents the best games in the survival horror genre. In no real particular order either. So if there are any games I didn't mention here, please be sure to list them in the comments because, I'm always looking for new games to play and I do really enjoy the survival horror genre. Or maybe you'd like to debate with me whether or not they represent the survival horror genre at all. I know it's still a very hotly debated topic. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started. The first game I want to recommend to people is probably the oldest game on this list, which is Project Firestart. This was a game for the Commodore 64 that was released in 1989. It predates Resident Evil, it predates Alone in the Dark, and I think it even predates Sweet Home, though I'm unsure of that for certain. But for a game as old as this one, it's amazing how much of what we think of when we think of a survival horror game is actually in this game. Combat, resource management, exploration, puzzles, all that good stuff. And of course, the horrors. And it's even got some stuff that would be used in Resident Evil as well. You got multiple endings, for example, and it even has a couple of unkillable enemies in there as well. So it's a pretty fascinating game from the time period, way ahead of its time. It even has some unique ideas of its own, namely the fact that one of the things you have to manage in this game is time. If you don't regularly check in with your CO while you're on the space station, they will assume you have been killed and actually nuke the station. So that's something else that you need to manage, not just your ammo, health, and all that stuff. This game is currently abandonware, so you can find a ROM for it and emulate it without any real legal repercussions. So I recommend giving it a shot, especially for fans of the survival horror genre who are really interested in exploring the origins. The next game I want to bring mention to is one I've actually talked a good deal about in the past, and that is Enemy Zero. This is a game created by Warp Games and Kenji Eno, and a lot of people consider it to be his masterwork. Essentially, just like in Firestart, you take the role of, a scientist on a space station, but the catch is instead of, visible aliens, the aliens in this game are invisible, and they kill you in one hit too, so that's not a good thing. But it also swings the other way. These enemies can be killed in a single hit as well, but the problem there is that your gun has a pathetically short range, so the monsters basically have to be within arm's reach to use it. It's got a charge period, which you need to get used to, and of course it has limited ammo, so you can't just go plugging away with it and expect to get results with it. So a lot of people say that difficult combat is necessary in a survival horror game, and this is probably the most difficult combat system in any survival horror game, period. To the game's detriment, honestly, because given the fact that you can drop dead so easily in this game, it can be a little tiring to have to play through sections again and again just because, you screwed up the timing or whatever as you were trying to kill a monster and, meant your end. It also doesn't help that you have manual saves, which is, another resource you have to manage. But the ideas present in Enemy Zero are so interesting, so compelling, that I would still say it's worth checking out today. And now for one of the fan favorites of the genre, Dino Crisis. Now, I put this one pretty low on my list of survival horror games because it is fatally flawed, but at the same time, it has some of the best ideas in regards to a survival horror game, and it mostly comes from the thread at hand. Dino Crisis is mostly remembered as Resident Evil with dinosaurs, but that's precisely why it's so interesting. The dinos are not just reskins of the zombies from Resident Evil. These things are far more dangerous. They are faster, they are tougher, they are smarter. not only does it take a lot more to put these things down than it does to kill a zombie in Resident Evil, they're harder to get away from. If you're bleeding, they'll follow that trail of blood to you. They can go through doors, and they can even disarm you. So it gets to the point where you're actively trying to avoid these things more so than any other survival horror game at the time. And then you got the T-Rex as well, and like you see that thing coming at you, you just know you can't take it out with your dinky little pistol, so you know you just gotta book it. It could be one of the best survival horror games of its time, but unfortunately, Dino Crisis has the fatal flaw of relying too heavily on puzzles. I mean, for crying out loud, to get through a lot of the doors in this game, you have to complete a word puzzle. I mean, what's just wrong with basic keys? No one complained about that. And towards the end of the game, the dinosaurs just kind of become a nuisance, especially when you realize that they aren't going to come into the rooms where the more elaborate puzzles are, because the game just simply isn't capable of rendering them. But when the game works, it really does work, and if there's one game I talk about here today that I feel should get a remake, it is definitely Dino Crisis. I would much rather play a remake of this than Resident Evil 5 or Code Veronica or whatever Capcom wants to do next. I'm hearing talk of a Resident Evil 9, I think, but I don't think I've seen any trailers for that yet, so I don't know if that's really going to be a thing yet. Up next is, believe it or not, an NES game of all things. Sweet Home is probably the most famous game on the NES to never be brought stateside, and the reason for that is this is a surprisingly disturbing game. Even though Sweet Home is decades old at this point and is made with super antiquated technology, it's still surprising how unnerving the story can be here, in addition to a lot of the violent imagery as well. And it also serves as pretty much the granddaddy of the entire survival horror genre. If you know your video game history, you know that Resident Evil actually started out as a remake of Sweet Home, and Resident Evil actually takes its name from Sweet Home as well. There's a lot of dialogue in the game that refers to the house as the place of residing evil. So, and even today, Sweet Home is still very interesting to play because of how it approaches survival horror. The game actually plays like an RPG of all things, which you think would be really strange, but it actually does work. I mean, you can get your combat in there, but you also have resources you have to manage, and again, it is a pretty scary game as well, so it does succeed on all accounts. And it also leverages the RPG genre in some really interesting ways as well, namely in the fact that permadeath is in place. If you lose any one of your party members, you are not getting them back, and that can be unnerving in and of itself. The fear of death is definitely present in this one. So yeah, this is another one that's highly recommended. Definitely emulate it, because I don't think this game is ever going to get a re-release, or get yourself a reproduction cart like what I have. Up next is going to be the Dead Space remake. Now, I know a lot of people are going to type in the comments that Dead Space isn't a survival horror game. However, I tend to disagree. While it is true that Dead Space does lean a little too heavily into combat, to a detriment towards the end of the game, it still does have all the elements that make something a survival horror game. Resource management is still present, combat is a big deal, and it does try to scare you. And in the opening hours of the game, it is pretty effective, all things considered. However, there are some workarounds that can, turn the game into a straight action game. Again, if you just favor one weapon, not have anything else in your inventory, you're going to be flush with ammo for the weapon. And in the remake, you have the ability to use telekinesis to, skewer enemies. But it still will function as a decent survival horror game if you play it with your weapons maxed out, as well as playing it on the higher difficulties too. So I would still say it's effective. Between the original Dead Space and the remake, though, I don't think there's any harm in playing the original over the remake, because I feel like it was too soon for the remake to begin with. The remake does still edge it out with its better graphics, more intense atmosphere, and just a simple fact that Isaac actually has a voice, so the story feels a little more complete. But both games are great. Just figure out a way to play Dead Space. It's one of the best games to come out of the past 20 years of gaming. And now we come to Fatal Frame. Now, I've always said that combat is necessary in a survival horror game, and one of the best things you can do with it is find a creative way to approach combat. And I can think of no better video game that comes up with a creative combat system than Fatal Frame. Essentially, in this game, your only means of defense is a camera that can exorcise the ghosts you face by taking pictures of them. But it's not as simple as just lining up the shot and snapping a shot of them from across the room. No, you actually gotta let the ghost get as close as possible in order to do the most damage. And let me tell you, the designs of these things are just unnerving. It is so cool, dude. Top it off with some great sound design, incredible use of the vibration function, better than any other game I can think of. And Fatal Frame is just a must for any fan of the survival horror genre. Now, it's debatable whether or not the first Fatal Frame is the best game in the series. There's definitely an argument to be made for the second game being superior. It definitely has a better story and some more polished gameplay mechanics, but it's sort of toned down the disturbing nature of the ghost, which is kind of why I prefer the original. I just think it's scarier, all things considered. But that's just my own opinion, and the second game is definitely worth checking out. The rest of the series, though, maybe only if you really like the first two games. And I'm probably going to get a lot of hate for this one, especially since I'm not talking about the original Silent Hill 2 here. But the Silent Hill 2 remake is just so good, guys. I know a lot of people hold the original in really high regard, and for good reason. It does represent some of the best story, art, and thematic stuff in a video game. But I've always said that the original Silent Hill 2 is good despite its gameplay, not because of it. The camera is sloppy, the controls are clunky, the combat is unsatisfying, and there's a lot of obtuse design with the puzzles, in addition to the fact that the survival aspects are pretty shallow as well. All of which is fixed in the remake. It uses a modern camera with modern analog controls, and it finds a way to keep the combat difficult without going too far. Resources are much more scarce this time, so you find yourself rationing, which also makes it harder to get the desired endings you want. There's new sections. It's good because of its gameplay now, in addition to everything else that made Silent Hill 2 good in the first place. I'm actually tempted to put this in my top 5, maybe even top 3 survival horror games, but the game is still relatively new. It's not even 2 months old yet, but I still wanted to highlight it here because it really was a great game. If the year ended tomorrow, it would probably be my game of the year. And up next, we got Amnesia: The Bunker. Now, I have been very critical this month of the original Amnesia, The Dark Descent, mostly because I feel it represents, the trend in horror games, where just this frustrating idea that a game can't be scary if you have the means to defend yourself. Well, for The Bunker, they do give you the means to defend yourself. And guess what? The game is still absolutely terrifying, and there's a reason it is terrifying. There's only one monster coming at you, but what you have available to you to fight it in the bunker, it's not enough to kill the damn thing. So, really, in the bunker, you're just exploring, trying to find a way out of the bunker, managing what resource you have, and just trying to stay off the monster's radar as you're doing so. And if the monster comes at you, you do have the means to fend it off, but it's only going to be a temporary solution. So more than any other game I talk about on this list, managing resources is just so important in this game. And that's a good thing because it just makes for a more complex experience than the original Amnesia could ever be, especially the sequel to it, War of Pigs. It really goes to show that the solution to making a horror game scarier is not taking away your means of defense, but just reinforcing the fact that no matter what you do, you're essentially screwed. And the best way to do that is to, keep the means to defend yourself. So, yeah, I didn't think that Amnesia would be mentioned on this, but yeah, the bunker is really damn good, guys. And then there's Signalis. Signalis is one of the recent indie games that have really kept the ideas of survival horror alive. And the reason for that is, unlike AAA games, which need to appeal to the widest markets, which is why so many so-called survival horror games tend to end up as action games, indie developers are just able to make the games they want, and Signalis is a good example of that. It's basically a best of in regards to the survival horror genre. It's got the resource management and combat of a Resident Evil game. It's got the psychological horror of a Silent Hill. It's got the gritty industrial style of something like Dead Space. But it's all painted in this surprisingly eerie and beautiful anime aesthetic too. It's like a horror game that takes place within Ghost in the Shell. It's just really interesting. This is one of the best horror games, one of the best games I've played in a long time. And I'm really glad it's getting more and more of an audience. And there's plenty of other great indie horror games coming out too. You got Crow Country, which I hear is really good. Haven't had a chance to play that yet. Alicia, I hear really good things about. And I've played a little bit of Tormented Souls, and while it wasn't really my cup of tea, it definitely will scratch that itch for people who still want the tank controls and fixed camera angles in their horror games, while it's still being a super polished experience. So yeah, Signalis, highly recommend it if you haven't played it already. However, if there's one game in the survival horror genre that I would recommend you play if you have never played anything in the genre, and if you would only play one game in the genre, it would have to be Resident Evil 2, the remake. This game really is the one that perfected the modern survival horror game. And the reason it did that is because it just took Resident Evil 2, which on its own is a pretty damn good game. The fixed camera angles and tank controls be damned. And it just recreates it with modern gameplay mechanics. It basically takes the over-the-shoulder aiming and analog movement from the newer Resident Evil games and just uses them for a horror game. And it's got the resource management, the puzzles are great. This is just a perfect survival horror game on all accounts. And I have a feeling like this is gonna remain the pinnacle of the genre for the longest time. Because after Resident Evil 2, the remake came out, Capcom started remaking other games in the genre, other Resident Evil games. Resident Evil 3, not a terrible game, but the remake was pretty sloppy. Resident Evil 4, they just never should have done. And now I hear that they're planning to do Code Veronica or Resident Evil 5, which again, I really don't want to see. I would rather just see new games in the series at this point, because none of the remakes they could do could possibly top Resident Evil 2 remake. But yeah, this is the game I recommend most if you have never played any games in the genre, and it's, considering how widely available it still is, it's the easiest to come by of the games I'm talking about on this list. But yeah, that's the survival horror genre, guys. I hope everything I said made sense and that you learned something here. And if you have your own ideas of what makes something a survival horror game, please leave it in the comments, but please be civil. If you make any good points, I'll consider it, because I just love talking about game design. That's part of the reason why I started this YouTube channel. But anyway, I feel like you guys have heard me talk enough. It's time we get to something else, so tune in next time and we'll move into another chapter of Gameology. See you then.